basket is running a little late tonight. That being said, Kristin Henning is not, and she is here with us. My name is Lori. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Director of Operations for Busboys and Poets Books, and it's honestly a privilege to see so many smiling faces, some masks. That's okay. And yeah, today's book was a no-brainer for us here at Busboys and Poets. I saw the cover, I saw the title, and said, we need to get her in here now. Because this book is something that people have been talking about for decades, but it hasn't quite come to the forefront until, quite honestly, with the uprising of 2020, the work of Black Lives Matter, and numerous groups around the country who during COVID-19 said, yeah, no more. We're fighting back. We are all unemployed, so we're going to go out there. And without further ado, I am very honored to introduce to you all Kristin Henning.
That looked more perilous than it actually was. I should have done what she did. So this is what we're going to do. This is the benefit of having two trial lawyers who do anything as an emergency, right? So we're still sure Jamie Lansing will be here, but we figured we wouldn't want to hold you all up, so we thought we would get started talking. And it just so happens, one of my best friends in the world just happens to be a leader, the leader in juvenile justice. So this is Mary Ann Stallet. Who gets an applause from this crowd because so many people know who she is. But she's the executive director for the National Juvenile Defender Center in Washington, D.C. So we figure we would get started. They've got to start running the live stream. And so we figured we would get started talking.
Beautiful. I am so excited to have an opportunity to be in conversation with one of my best friends in the whole world, Kristin Henning. And when Chris started talking about writing this book years ago, it meant so much to us as a community because, of course, she's telling the story of the work of defending children in courts. And it has meant so much to just be on this journey with her. And so I just want to start out by asking her, Chris, why did you write this book? What inspired you to do so?
Yeah, so here's the deal. I have been representing children in Washington, D.C. for 25 years. And in that entire 25 years, I have represented 4 white children. That's it. In the nation's capital. So that would lead you to believe either that there are white kids in Washington, D.C., all of you who live in the area know that's not true, or that white children do not commit crimes. And we also know that's not true based on all the data, all the statistics that are out there. So it is really hard to do this work for a very long time and not want to blow up the whole system, to be quite frank. Short of that, I really began to think about, well, why? First of all, I wanted to know, is this happening everywhere else in the world? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, if it's happening everywhere, why? I also wanted to know what impact the racial disparities were having across the country on Black and brown children. And then I also wanted to know, well, if the disparities exist, are they having an impact on public safety? Are they improving public safety? And then if not, what are we going to do about it? So that's basically the sum total of really sort of the overview of the book. The other reason why I wrote it, and for those of you who haven't started to read in, you'll see that the book is full of stories. Stories about Black children that I have been representing. Also, it's about stories, high-profile stories you all read about. And so I really, more than anything else, wanted to give voice to children, right? To children who have been impacted. And so that's really why I wrote it.
And so, Chris, you mentioned that you wanted to know, is this happening across the country? Your experience in DC, so you started to dig in. So we know the answer to that is yes. So 1, I would like to hear you talk a little bit about that. And number 2, how could people not know? How could people not know how we are treating our own children across the country. And what do you hope this book does?
I mean, so the answer is, check and see if this is him. So the answer is, yes, we know it's happening everywhere. And what we see, like, at every single entry point in the legal system and the criminal legal system, we see drastic racial disparities. From the point of arrest to pretrial detention, so once they arrest the child, making a decision whether they're going to stay in lockup, in trial, judges with the exact same facts, as empirical evidence, judges with the same facts, judges are more likely to find a child guilty, and then all the way through the system to incarceration. The DPA, more likely to transfer children up to adult court to be tried as adults, and then more likely to get a serious long-term prison sentence as an adult, and the like. And so, the question is, why don't people know? Shockingly, a number of, I think a couple of things. One, adult defenders who have been doing the work for a long time, even us, get complicit, to be quite frank. They get complicit and come to court. And so in a place like DC, where literally almost every single child that I represent is African American, you just take it for granted that this is the status quo, or that like we said earlier, that white kids are not committing crime. And it is not until we, even as defenders who've been doing the work forever, go out into the community and sit and watch and talk to young people, that we realize just how frequent and impactful police are in their lives. And I can honestly say, as long as I've been doing the work, until I started asking the right questions, which is, how often do you see a police officer every single day? That gets you a radically different answer than, how can I help you in this case? I'll ask the question, how do you feel in the presence of police officers? I get a radically different answer than if I just ask questions about the case that I'm representing them on. So I think one is asking the right questions. Number two, in terms of like the average person who's not in the courthouse day to day, people don't know because of the media. I'm just being straight up. What are the stories if I asked you? I'm a professor, so I do very interactive workshops. If I asked you, what is the last story that you heard about about a black child on the news, I guarantee you it was a negative story. Show of hands, it was a negative story. It was a story about some criminal act by a child, instead of being a story about the presence of police officers in black communities or the good things that black children have done. So we're gonna do a switch out here.
Thank you so much, Kristin.
No. So that was Marion Scally. Marion Scally is the executive director of the National Juvenile Defender Service. So we just thought we would substitute her into the room on that. But you want to read?
Well, forgive me for running because I'm so in love with your book. It's just, but I'm so impressed. I don't know how deeply you've gotten into it.
We only did two questions. She asked why, what prompted me to write the book, and I expounded a little bit on the racial disparities and why people in general don't understand or aren't aware of the racial disparities in the system. So that's what we started.
Well, look, I'm so psyched to be with everybody, and I mean the reason that I find Kristin's book so remarkable, when we now have a real flowering literature on race and racism in the criminal justice system, is that this is about a lot more than that. It's about the sociology of black childhood in America, and so it goes. It looks at the criminal justice system as just the end point of a whole series of double standards and bigotries and biases that permeate our society. So I don't know. I thought I was very taken by your book. I finished it last night. But maybe would you tell everybody the story of maybe Eric, and then Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. So Eric is a 13-year-old boy who on a Saturday night was watching a movie. And in that movie, he sees someone making a Molotov cocktail. In his 13-year-old mind, he says, hey, that looks cool. Let me see if I can make something that looks like that. He then races into his kitchen, he grabs a glass bottle, and he begins to pour liquid into the bottle, anything that he can find. He pours in Pine Sol, he pours in a bleach, things that we know. Orange juice, right? Whatever he can find, right? Exactly. Things that we know won't be flammable. And then, this is my favorite part, he takes a piece of toilet paper and he runs the toilet paper from the inside of the bottle to the outside of the bottle and closes the cap. Again, in our adult minds, we know that toilet paper is going to burn out before it even reaches the cap. So he grabs the bottle on Saturday night, he throws it in his book bag. His mom has white carpet, I've been there, seen it, and he didn't want it to spill. His mother drives him to school on Monday morning. He puts his book bag through the conveyor belt. And the school resource officer sees it and says, what is that? At which point, he immediately says, oh, that's nothing, you can throw it away. He goes on to class, minding his own business, and next thing he knows, the fire department shows up, police officers show up, they yank him out of class, and that begins literally a 9-month ordeal. Can we do it now? Great. Thank you. A 9-month ordeal in the juvenile legal system. And we at Georgetown represented him, and literally, we had evidentiary hearings, we called expert witnesses, not to mention the amount of money that the District of Columbia was spending on the attorneys and prosecutors and experts to litigate this case. And so what's remarkable about this story is a few months later, I was giving a talk at a conference in New Haven, Connecticut. And a white woman comes up to me after I tell the story about Eric. And she says to me, my son did the exact same thing. And I asked her, what happened to your son? And she says, he was placed in advanced accelerated science classes.
Chemistry, right?
Chemistry, exactly, right? Just unbelievable difference, right? And then there's Jason. So you asked about Jason. Jason's story also occurs in the District of Columbia. He and 4 friends, they're in high school, and they do what high school kids do, which is they go and they crash college parties. So they go over to George Washington University and crash a fraternity party. They get kicked out, of course, by the college boys. And that really would have been the end of the story, but unfortunately, one of the kids, not Jason, not my client, drew a swastika, unfortunately, on the wall outside as he was leaving. All the kids, the kid who drew the swastika took off running, and all the other kids stayed. And the police came and arrested him. So here's where the racial dynamic comes in. He and my client, I ended up getting appointed to represent Jason. Jason comes to court. Jason comes to court on a Saturday, which is unusual. But what it means to have Saturday court is that you don't have a magistrate judge. You have an actual associate judge who's on rotation. It was an associate judge I had appeared in front of many, many times. Very well-meaning, defense, minded at least, due process minded, I should say, not defense minded, a due process. A due process minded judge, and the marshals on a Saturday they're understaffed. He says immediately the judge turns to the marshals, because the marshals are saying, we can't bring out all of these kids at one time because we don't have enough staff. So we're going to have to call the kids 2 at a time instead of all 5 of the kids. The judge turns to him, literally rears back in his seat, and says, wait a minute, we don't need marshals for these kids. You can unhandcuff them and bring them all out. I am never going to detain these kids. Look at them. Look at their appearance. I would never detain them. So basically what he's seeing is 5 white boys who look just like him. All of whom are there with 2 parents with them. And so his whole analysis is, without knowing anything, you all, this is what's really important about the story. He doesn't know whether they've been charged with rape, murder, burglary, nothing. He has no idea. He just sees them and he immediately says, I'm not going to detain them. And so the contrast, I think, is absolutely phenomenal, both in the Connecticut story versus Eric's story, but also Jason versus Eric.
What's the end of that story with the kid? Because he turned out to be a skinhead, right?
Oh, yeah, so Jason's story, he does turn out to be active in the skinheads, but he got a consent decree, which in the District of Columbia, which is pretty much unheard of at that time, it's basically a diversion. So he was diverted out of the system for, after having crashed the party, being charged. They were charged with burglary, but ultimately so first of all, that in and of itself is ridiculous, charged with burglary for any kid, but they were charged with burglary. And then he got a consent decree and he was diverted out of the system, notwithstanding all of the racial overlap. Mind you, my 13-year-old, I didn't say this about Eric, Eric was just 13 years old, and he was watching a movie, so radical difference.
And the other kid who made the Molotov cocktail, he saw the same movie. It was basically the same thing happening, right? He made love, and at his school, he was treated like a harmless prank.
Right, absolutely, more than a harmless prank. He was, and this is what you talked about, you asked me about adolescence, where you made the reference to the sociology of childhood and adolescence.
Yeah.
What is so critical is that we want to reward creativity, right? We really want kids who are, who take the initiative. Maybe not make a real Molotov cocktail, right? But he's not researching it on the internet, but we want that, we reward that. And we rewarded that for the white kid and the red kid by putting him in advanced classes.
It's so interesting how these images penetrate your consciousness. So on January the 6th, our youngest daughter was with me that day, and she'd come in, and she was in a little side office, and we were looking out the window before I went onto the house floor, and we saw these waves of people coming up from the Trump protest, and she said, are we going to be okay? Are the police going to be able to hold it? And the image I immediately had in my mind was from June the 2nd, when there was a Black Lives Matter protest at the Capitol the day after Trump and Barr had called that police riot in Lafayette Square. And there were hundreds of National Guardsmen and women lined up on the Capitol. And that came to mind, and I said, it's going to be okay. Of course, I didn't see any of those guardsmen, but I figured, how could we have them on that day and not here? This has been going on. So anyway, I found your book to be eye-opening. I've got some other questions for you. One, will you explain the title of your book?
Oh, yes. So the rate, I'm going to start by saying the book was supposed to be called, or I wanted it to be called, Arrested Development, from Emmett Till to Tamir Rice. And for a good 2-3 years, that's what I thought the book was going to be called. And then I was told by multiple people that I could not call my book Arrested Development in light of the TV show, which over my head, I wasn't aware at all. And so that was one thing. And then also, this is what was really shocking about the original title. I was told that people would not know who Emmett Till and Tamir Rice were. That to me was shocking. And so, I know, right? I was, but they were like, if you want to reach a wider audience, you really have to remember that. So the Rage of Innocence is really about the rage that I hope that every single person will have when any one child is deprived their opportunity to benefit from the innocence of adolescence and the freedom of adolescence. But it's also more nuanced than that, right? There are multiple layers of meaning. One of them, which I think is most salient for the book, is the rage that Black children have when they are told day after day after day that they are bad, that they are criminal, that they are unwelcome. And so what we see from that is that Black children, right, stand up for themselves. They resist the labels, right? They push back against these inappropriate, unfair labels. And so you see it manifest, for example, in police encounters, right? So young Black children feel that they are unfairly targeted, aggressively treated, disparately treated, and then as a result, they speak out. And that's some of that rage that then gets, it's a vicious loop that then gets evaluated or perceived as threatening.
I had a couple of interesting encounters with some of my colleagues in the House this week. One of them was Marjorie Taylor Greene, who operates purely on stereotypes, you know, and I've never been properly introduced to her, so I didn't, you know, I was surprised that she came up and started yelling at me like we were in the middle of an argument. It wasn't like my name's Marjorie Taylor Greene and yell at you. So she came up and started saying, and when are you going to have your hearings about the violence at Black Lives Matter protests? And the first thing that popped in my mind was Kyle Rittenhouse. I said, you mean like Kyle Rittenhouse, like the white kid who went and killed 2 people with his assault weapon at a Black Lives Matter protest? So then she starts screaming this machine instead of screaming at me. But you know, I wonder how much of what's going on with like the attack on Black Lives Matter to a certain extent, but today, especially critical race theory, is just based on all of these deranged images, you know, which have centuries behind them, right? Of kind of sinister potency.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many threads to pull from that. I mean, one of the things, and there are several things, going to your very first comment about you know, this outrage over Black Lives Matter. One of the things that I actually write about in the book is a chapter 5 called Policing the Politics of Identity, of Adolescent Identity Development. So the politics of adolescent identity development. And I explore explicitly Black adolescent identity development. And I talk about how, really falling out of that last question about rage of innocence, how Black children in particular, keeping the focus there for a moment, learn to speak out the best way that they can. That they don't have the traditional opportunities, you know, maybe to, you know, sit in City Hall and speak out, or they're not old enough to vote, or whatever the tradition, or they have no faith in the traditional democratic process, right? But we know that really for one's own mental health, one's own self-worth, it's really important, and particularly during the years of adolescence, to be able to speak out against what we see as unjust and have an opportunity to meaningfully influence how things will change. How do I make the world a better place? And if I'm excluded from those opportunities, then that really has an impact on my mental health. So that ties back to Black Lives Matter, because I talk about how even Black protests, right? Even Black adolescent protest is criminalized. And that Black children, Black teenagers, have really found their voice, and they found their place in the Black Lives Matter movement. And yet, what is the first thing we do? We treat that like everything else, like we criminalize that. And you're absolutely right. The through line, the historical racial through line, you know, is evident throughout. So we think about how is it that an Emmett Till can be lynched at the age of 14, right? You know, at the outset of the civil rights movement, and in part, not even in part, that is largely about the symbolic statements. I think not only to the larger Black community that, you know, integration won't be tolerated, your voice, your protest won't be tolerated, but I think, and I talk about this a bit in the book, that it is especially important to limit or to attempt to limit adolescence during those adolescent years, before they speak out, before they gain their independence, before they, you know, begin to test those limits and assert their authority. And so I think that some of that backlash about particularly young people in Black Lives Matter is, I'm holding you back. I'm setting the limits right now during your adolescent years, before you rise up and become, a Jamie Raskin.
Well, when you think about the way that the the modern civil rights movement was created by young people in their teens and their early 20s in Mississippi, in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I've just been astonished at the rapidity with which the right wing has been able to manufacture a total propaganda slur against the Black Lives Matter movement, because the nonviolence of it, the massive quality of it was an amazing thing. Millions of people in nonviolent protests all over America.
And internationally.
And internationally, and then they take these episodes of right-wingers bringing violence or instigators coming and bringing violence, maybe one or two episodes of rioting taking place, which were quickly denounced as a breach of nonviolence, but overwhelming nonviolent movement, and they turn that into this threat of young black people out of control. And meantime, they're whitewashing what took place on January 6th, when we all saw that this was a massive fascist, racist, violent attack on the Congress and on the democracy itself. I mean, it's been an absolutely startling thing for me to observe, and reading your book has been really helpful in terms of thinking about the underlying racial structure of the images that are coded into right-wing language.
Yeah, and I think I'll say two things that I always like to tease out. So, there's the right-wing rhetoric, which is very intentional and has been intentional throughout history, right? To maintain the structures and to justify physical abuse, of black people. But here's the thing that I always like to remind folks, and this is, I really try to get this in the book, is that what starts as intentionality, what starts as political rhetoric for political gain, also then becomes embedded in the American psyche.
Culture.
That's right. As a subconscious bias, right? And so that then even good people, right, walk through a park and are afraid of black children. Or even, when Black Lives Matter happens and, the people take to the streets, I support the cause, but I'm afraid to go out there. Right? Because I'm afraid of, the violence and the like. And so I always like to push us, beyond the intentionality, which is huge and significant, especially right now. But it becomes subconscious for the rest of us.
Yeah. Well, say some stuff, if you would, about, the successes that have taken place in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of critical race theory, in terms of people waking up to this, because we've certainly made a lot of progress in a lot of places in the country. Progressives are changing things, academia is changing. I mean, this attack on critical race theory, they don't know the first thing about critical race theory. They've never read Richard Delgado or Kim Crenshaw or Gary Null. They don't know the first thing about it. But what that's an attack on is the fact that there is dialogue taking place that allows children of all backgrounds to enter a discussion about the real history of the country. I mean, that's what they're trying to whitewash, right? So, I mean, aren't we in the middle of real progress in terms of thinking about these?
Yeah, I think we are. And I'll just say, one thing about, critical race theory, it's again, the political, excuse me, making this a political issue. Really, it's what it's about, because you're absolutely right. They haven't read, they have no idea. And so much of their interpretation of what is critical race theory is far more radical than it actually is. It is truly a statement of how race impacts, how laws are made, how laws are interpreted, how laws are applied, and that's just factual, right? That's just absolutely, factual. But, in terms of progress, it's so sad that we need these hot button moments. We need the death of a George Floyd to move us into action. But we see it repeatedly throughout history. Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, then we get the civil rights movement. I think now with the killing of George Floyd, one of the things that happened from the adolescence lens was, for example, the police-free schools movement, right? And folks, you hear about it now, but the police-free schools movement had been active for like 10 years in places like Oakland, California, of schools deciding we're going to try something else, right? We're going to, at least think outside the box for a moment about what we can do. I think, I will say, I know you want me to say go positive, and I think that is a positive. I think we have more work to do in those areas, which is we're talking about it more. That's the positive. We are taking immediate steps, legislative reform, but we're not putting the resources in to bring it to completion, right? So with the police-free schools movement, you've got cities that are saying, numbers of them, saying people will move police from schools, but then you're not devoting the resources, the millions of dollars that we now need into mental health services, counselors, smaller class sizes, and the like. So we still have work to do, but it's a great question. We're seeing conversation. I'm disappointed that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act didn't pass, but in terms of juvenile justice work, most of that is happening at the state level anyway. We're seeing slow progress there as well.
Yeah. So what is, speak to people about kind of the end of your book and looking forward, and what we can do to not just to improve the prospects of individual kids who get taken up in the system, but also to change the images that permeate cultural consciousness, and then also make us a more civilized society at a time when we're becoming more uncivilized and more divided and polarized.
Yeah. So you asked the hard question, which is like, how do we get to the cultural shift? Which is, I have ideas, throughout chapter 12 about, and we can talk about a couple of them, but about how do we sort of almost tinker around the edges, for lack of better words. But the cultural shift is the harder part, right? And I like to, Brian Stevens talks about getting proximate to young people. Really what we have to do is learn that Black children are children too. And that's the hardest part. And like I said, it's so deeply embedded in the American psyche, again, even good folks, I can call good or bad, but folks who are woke and conscious, have work to do in that area. So that means, what can I do? Wherever I sit in society, whatever station I occupy, whatever job I have, what can I do to get to know and engage with, Black children so I can see them for their value, for their worth, for their creativity, for their potential, for their smarts, for all of that. So that's one of the things. One of my psychologist friends taught me this word that I just adopted and I love, is that every child in America, including every Black child, needs one irrationally caring adult. Isn't that beautiful? One irrationally caring adult. And they're better off if they have a team of irrationally caring adults. So what does that mean? That means every single one of us was a teenager and we made mistakes. We did some really stupid stuff, and sometimes our stupid stuff had really horrible outcomes for other people, right? Because we didn't think it through. But I'm going to stand by you. I'm going to support you. I'm going to give you the services, mental health, whatever it is that you need, and I'm going to be there with you to shepherd you through these adolescent years. So that's one thing. I think that's part of the cultural shift, getting proximate and being that irrationally caring adult for someone else. Also, it's about doing the hard work. Right? Instead of, I think the go-to, even for folks who are woke, for lack of better words, is, but I care about crime, or crime is rising, right? That is the gateway out of the conversation that I want to have, is to talk about crime. And so, yes, there's crime. Every single one of us wants to be safe. I want to be safe. Every Black community wants to be safe. The question is, how do we do it? How do we do it that is equitable to the ways in which we would respond to a white child? How do we do it in a way that's most effective? And research shows that over-policing isn't effective, right? So we've got to get ourselves out of the psyche that the only way to have a safe society is through traditional law enforcement methods. And that's for us, for folks who are conservative, right wing, as well as those of us who are, because some of the most draconian, we know this, some of the most draconian criminal justice reform bills, like in the 90s, came out of, Democratic administration. So we just got to be careful what our solutions are there. So,
yeah. Well, what is your message to kids? Like, are you viewing The Rage of Innocence as a book that can be taken into juvenile facilities,
Yeah,
schools,
question.
or is there going to be another way to try to transpose the dialogue for young people?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. Here's what I found so far with younger people reading the book, is that they see themselves in it. So that in and of itself is a part of the healing, it's part of the recommendations that I offer up towards the end of the book, is about creating space for young people to talk freely and openly about the trauma that they experience as a result of racial disparities, as a result of racial trauma, as a result of policing specifically. And I don't think there's space for that. I don't even think, to be quite frank, as a defense attorney, that we're so busy, we're so focused on, working on that individual case that sometimes we forget that macro picture. And so I hope that this book, one, opens a conversation, creates a space for young people with their teachers, right, to engage and around this conversation. So I've already gotten some invitations from teachers, high school teachers, excuse me, to come into their classes. I had a wonderful conversation at Georgetown Day School with a group of students who were mesmerized by the conversation. So I also think, and actually most of the students in that class were white students, but having white students understand the issue. So at the same age, right, when you talk about protest and you talk about Black Lives Matter, we want allies out on the street, which they were, in the Black Lives Matter protests. And so what I think having white students read this book and see themselves in this book is really helpful. And then being in conversation with Black students. I also think that the book, I hope, and as you read it, you'll know that Eric, who I talk about, you asked me about, knows about the book, let's put it that way. And he's very pleased. He and his family are very happy because they want the stories told.
How's he doing there?
He's doing good. He's doing very good, yeah. So, I don't want you guys to get real quiet about it, because I want you to read the book. I tell you.
All right, well, should we open it up, or,
Yes.
No, let's open
Lori
it up. I
said
don't
yes.
want to dominate the thing.
Lori has a mic. We can feature questions back in.
I have a mic. We got a question over here.
Hi, thank you for this book. I want to ask you how you carry this. It feels like a weight. How do you do that? Thank you.
As I look back to my friend, Mary Ann Scally, so we did a program last night, and honestly, I sobbed for 30 minutes afterwards. I literally, so my brother knows this as well. There are certain chapters of the book that were extremely difficult to write. I would say chapter 11 was one of them, and it took me a long time to get through it. And I cried a lot writing it. You will see throughout the book that I am telling stories of my clients. And so I was reliving those stories more than I ever thought I would. I just didn't expect that. You go in and for years now, I look at Sam Sonnenberg, my fabulous, I consider you a mentor. We worked together at the DC Public Defender Service. I learned so much from her. But I learned about compassion for our clients and hearing these stories. So for years, I would have a folder, I have an electronic folder where I would keep the police reports from the craziest shock to conscious stories, the ones that bother me the most. So I've had those. And so now, how many ever years later, I'm going back and reliving those. And I just was traumatized, right? And I feel bad saying that because if I'm traumatized, imagine how my clients were traumatized. This is not a book about me. It's about them. And so I know how much I lived through it. So there's that. It's the client stories. It was chapter 11. A lot of it, there are some pieces that are biographical. It is impossible as a Black woman in America to not be touched by the criminal legal system in some way. And so there's some of my own story in there and our family stories in there. That was hard I just didn't expect that. And then the third thing that was very hard is because I am giving voice to other people's stories, I really wanted to honor that. I lost a lot of sleep about telling somebody else's story because I didn't want to tell it wrong. And so what I ended up doing was watching video after video after video of the parents of those high-profile cases So the parents of Jordan Edwards, right? The parents of Samira Rice, right? The mother of Samira Rice, Khalif Browder's mother, right? So, and I was literally like, I mean, it just took forever. I mean, most of that is in chapter 11. And so getting through that was just, it was devastating in a way that I just didn't anticipate. So, yeah, I appreciate the question. I appreciate it. And then even now in the telling of the story, I had a really hard time sometimes telling. Depending on what questions get asked, I can really go there.
Kristin, you mentioned a couple times in passing almost that you represented kids who have been picked up on throwing snowballs at cars, or buses, whatever, and it jumped out at me because for reasons I won't go into, I had to read Patrick Buchanan's autobiography, and he talked about growing up in Chevy Chase and how one of his favorite things to do was to throw snowballs at metro buses, especially as the housekeepers were being brought in the mornings on the metro buses to clean houses. He would throw snowballs and then sometimes get a housekeeper. And then it struck me that you were representing kids who were being prosecuted for lobbing missiles at. I wonder if you would reflect for a moment about what you're seeing as a local story about Washington, D.C., and what the prism of Washington offers your understanding.
So I love this question, and maybe a different reason for what you're getting there. So there's two sides to the story. There's part of the story about the local story for Washington, D.C. is progress. So when I think about progress, I'm thinking about Carl Racine, who is our first elected Attorney General, who's done a phenomenal job, who gets these issues. And yes, he wants a safe society, but how do we get there? That is always the question that we're coming back to. And so the story that, I think the local story of Washington, D.C., I give it a little bit of historical perspective. I talk about kids getting prosecuted for throwing snowballs, quote unquote, missiles at police cars, because that's the way I grew up practicing. Anybody who's been at the D.C. Public Defender Service for the longest time, before we had a call receipt, that's what we were seeing. Normal adolescent behaviors. And I really want to say this both as a local story and as a national story. When people give me pushback about this book, conservatives, right wing, they come at me, they come at me, on Facebook or wherever about how, could you write this race-baiting book and how can you, attack police? First of all, it's not a book, about attacking police officers. What it's about is getting people to understand that a very, very small percentage of children of any race commit the serious violent crimes that we're afraid of, like rape, murder, and the like. 80 to 90% of children in American courts are in there for normal adolescent behaviors. Stupid stuff, right? And that was Washington, D.C. story for a very long time. And now we have seen a shift under Carl Racine, who has just been more thoughtful about it. Like, creative alternatives to diversion. And when I talk about diversion, I'm not talking about bringing kids to the front door of court, because they're already traumatized by then, right? You've already arrested them, you've already handcuffed them, you've already brought them to court. I'm talking about diversion in the community, right? So Carl Racine's office, his team, they've got restorative justice at the schools and things of that nature. That's what cities need to do. So we see more of that, and even still, we still see some slip-ins, right? We still have cases, of kids, particularly on the metro, on the metro, kids get arrested for all kinds of stuff. But there's a high intolerance for adolescents on the metro system, so we still got to work on that. And there's sometimes serious crime on the metro as well. But we've got to. So I think that's the local story. The local story matches the national story, except that the DC story, I think because, I could be wrong about this, I'm purely speculating, but because DC has been known as the chocolate city so long, that people, which is not people, right? But people, I think, are more willing to just accept, well, it must be that if so many black kids are in DC, that is a function of the District of Columbia. It is just not. That data has long been gone. Those stats have long been gone. We've long not been, predominantly, solely African American city, but yet that vestige of the only, I can literally walk in court and and not see a white kid for weeks and weeks at a time. It's just unbelievable. It really is.
We've got a question from online. So, Tasha Colin Martin says, "Hi Kristin, I was glad to see that you use the word youth in the title. In the book, do you discuss the criminalization that impacts both adolescent boys and girls?"
Oh, what a great question. I so appreciate this question because I really made an intentional decision to weave girls throughout the entire book, right? And so I think so often the conversation about race and crime is about Black men and Black boys, which is critically important. But Black girls are impacted the same ways, with discriminatory stops, with the traumatic effects of policing in the community, all of that is there for Black girls. So what I didn't want to isolate it or segregate it to a chapter as an afterthought, right? So every single chapter in the book weaves together to the greatest extent possible stories of girls, right? And in my practice, I represent girls, right? And all of the national tropes about Black girls being Jezebels and sexually, promiscuous, all of that plays out, in the ways in which they are viewed and treated in the cases that I represent. On occasion, there are times where I do set apart a part of the chapter specifically for girls, because I like to say there's sometimes distinctions that need to be drawn out about the way Black girls are treated, including the notion of sexuality, including the conversation about the ways Black girls are criminalized for the way they dress. So dress code violations. So there are some unique pieces about girls, but otherwise they are woven, all of the narratives and the stories are woven throughout with girls. So, I know there are a couple of questions.
Thank you both for being here with us tonight. I'm a Stone Park resident. I'm also on the board of the Stone Foundation. And one of the things we're working on is a project with our youth, and we recently had an opportunity to talk with some of them in wards 4 and 5, which are disproportionately Black wards and low-income wards. And the thing that we've heard over and over again from our middle schoolers and high schoolers is that they just don't have anything to do. I also have the privilege of working with our law and policymakers in the State House, and there's a very apparent disconnect between the conversations that are happening there and what's going on in the streets. And as a lawyer, I have that special pass that takes me into all of these different spaces. So my question is what can people like me who live here in Tacoma Park and these other cities, who are grassroots activists, who are working with our communities, what can we do to better inform our policymakers so that they can bring us the resources and programs that we actually need for our youth? Can I give that to you?
I can tell she's looking at them, right?
I suppose turnabout is fair play.
Professor Raskin was a professor at my law school at WCL.
There are a bunch of WCL people there. Time to do it. Well, no, I mean, it's a great question. The way I think of it is that each of us needs to take responsibility in our own way to interact with young people and to galvanize young people in the really dire times that we're in. So what I do, here's my project, it's called Democracy Summer, and we recruit high school kids from all over our area. It's now gone nationwide, and we train them on the history of social change, nonviolent social change, the seminar that the Republican Party needs, and we train them on that, and then we train them on the tactics of political organizing today. So voter registration, voter mobilization, canvassing, and so on. As a law professor, which I used to be, Elliot will tell you, we created a project that I will definitely send your book to Kristin, called the Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project, which you know from WCL. Stephanie Joseph was a Marshall Brennan Fellow, and we might have some other ones here. But basically, they would go out and, we have some people, we've got more lawyers per capita in our area than I think anywhere on earth. So we got surplus legal consciousness among some people. we've got a deficit of legal understanding among other people. So we mobilize the law students to go out into high schools to teach about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And of course, when you're teaching kids about their rights, that immediately makes teachers and principals nervous. But when you're teaching kids about rights, you're also teaching them about responsibilities. Because if I've got a right, it means also other people have a right, and I've got a responsibility to respect their rights. But nobody really has that conversation with them until somebody gets in trouble, you know? And so I'm proud of the work that the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project has been doing. Here in District 20, we've got a great delegation. We both took my seat in the state senate after I left the Senate, and Janelle Wilkins and David Boone and George Raccoon. All of them have similar type projects where they get young people involved in politics with them, and they're staying in touch in that way. But we do have to remember not just to use them as interns for our projects, but to listen to them about what's going on with them in school and their communities.
That's great.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for this conversation, and Professor Henning, I'm a student at Georgetown Law, so it's great to see you here. My question was, there was a recent story about, I forget the exact state, but it was a high school that there have been a lot of fights recently. I think there were about 23 students arrested over the course of a few days. And a group of fathers who call themselves Dad Patrol, I believe, something like that, kind of stepped in and started monitoring the school lunch, being around, and there's been apparently there's no incidents since, right? And it's a powerful story, and it kind of made me think, is part of the conversation with this book not just decreasing police presence, footprint, and so on, but also a more robust role for the community and kind of stepping in and, you know, being those credible messengers, getting to issues at the source, and how do we build more of that infrastructure so the community is driving that kind of public safety process more.
So I love, don't you love it when my students give you the questions full of answers? So yes, yes, and yes, all of the above. So what I love about the story, you all should find the story if you haven't seen it. It's absolutely fabulous. But it's not just giving lip service to this idea that we want police-free schools. That if we think creatively and outside the box, we can come up with alternatives, right? And so in that scenario, a group of fathers got together and literally put on t-shirts, and they literally line up as the kids are entering school. What is for any of you who haven't visited an urban school system lately, you won't know that they're now kids entering through metal detectors, right? And security guards, okay? They alleviate that. They alleviate that by having fathers there to escort the kids in, to be at lunchtime. I think it's fabulous because it shows that it can be done with the resources. The one cautionary tale, and so let me actually add another thing that I think that story tells us, is what you said about community engagement. It's that irrationally caring adult concept that we all have a role to play, no matter what station we have in life, what role we have, what job we have. But what I want to be careful about is not having the local legislative body abandon schools without resources. Does that make sense? I kept thinking about this story. I kept watching the video over and over again, thinking about, so how old are these fathers? Are they retired? How are they going to do this every day? Because that's not realistic.
Can they come to the Capitol with me?
So I think it's phenomenal, and we should engage the community that way. But we should also have resources for what credible messengers. So Max, thank you for that question, because some of the alternatives. So people talk to me about violence. Well, you keep talking about these, kids playing with the fake Molotov cocktail and the snowballs. Well, what about the, murder and rapists? Well, guess what? There are actually evidence-based, proven strategies for how to engage with even the most serious offenders. That doesn't require us to lock them under the jail, and especially for adolescents. And included in that our violence interrupter programs, credible messenger programs, which take folks who've been previously involved in the system, and then they go back and they engage with young people and help them work their way through. There's multi-system therapy. There's all kinds of community-based interventions that have been proven to work, vocational opportunities, things of that nature. So it's a beautiful question. Yes, yes, and yes.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Good to see you. Good to see you too. So two things. One, Mr. Askin, just want to let you know there's a great role for you right now. There's a $100 million appropriation ask in OJBP's budget to close youth prisons and take the dollars that we saved from those failed institutions and invest them in these similar services. So I urge you to support that whenever you can and get your colleagues behind it too. We've got it in both appropriation bills. But what I want you to comment to, because we're sitting in Maryland, and Maryland is second only to Alabama, so I think you know what I'm going to say. But my gauge is that 1 out of every 13 arrested children in this country, those kids are charged with a gun. And in Maryland, you're second only to Alabama. And the number of children that send to the adult court every year. And what is Maryland going to say? I'm not going to transfer. Right. So if people wanted to know what to do, call Senator Smith. But I would love, that's the most egregious.
Yes.
When we strip children of even remote protection. And they're all black children.
Absolutely. I didn't put it there, so that's Marcy. She's coming for you.
Come on, with respect.
Yes, citizen project. But, I mean, this is critical. This is the absolute critical issue. This is the sort of the penultimate issue, so second only to just, learning to treat, kids, period. But it is the ways in which we have adultified Black children, right? There's really important research that I, talk about in plain language in the book about the ways in which we as society, both police officers and civilians, see African American children as older than they are. And in fact, 4.5 years older than they actually are. Why does that matter? Because then in our psyche, think about a Tamir Rice is 12, he gets seen as older and can be shot down without empathy, without remorse, without consequence even. Right? And then at the back end of the system, for a kid who gets arrested and put into the system, by the time you're age 16, you're still a child. How many are 16-year-olds? Okay? Or teach and work with 16-year-olds. 16-year-olds are 16-year-olds in the brain, and their emotions are just but yet, because of this phenomenon of adultification, Black children in particular are perceived to be 20, 21 years old, literally treated as adults. So I just gave that as a sort of a scientific backdrop explaining the phenomenon. But across the country, we've got, starting in the 90s, in response to very intentional, try the word again, politicization of Blackness and criminality, where it was in the 90s when there was a temporary uptick in crime that we had this massive shift in juvenile justice codes, allowing for the increase of transfer of youth from adult court from juvenile court to adult court for less serious offenses at younger ages, and we haven't undone that. We haven't rolled those back since the data was, since the super predator myth of the 90s was disproven. We've never rolled those back. And I know Maryland has had, the statute has gone up, the amendments have gone up, and it's never passed.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
you are.
just to go on the 2 points. One is, the first one you raised is a progressive caucus priority. Vice chair of the Progressive Caucus, so we're totally with you and fighting for that. The other one about treatment of juveniles as adults, and it's interesting because when I was in the state senate for 10 years, we were able to get a lot of stuff done. We abolished the death penalty. We abolished mandatory minimum sentences in drug cases. We decriminalized marijuana. We did all this stuff. We fought that issue, as you know, unsuccessfully. And I think it's been limited to murder and I know he's in 33 different charges. Okay, so that's right. We were just trying to boil it down to I think murder, maybe 2 or 3. And now Mike Miller was president then and was very conservative in the Senate on all mistakes, and there's always a fight with him. But it might be a better time to do it, and there we can check in with my successor in office, Will Smith, who is the chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. So I imagine there could be some action on that.
I would love to be heard from you.
Yeah.
He's already said it's going to take it out, but it'd be great if you could encourage him.
Awesome. He called me up later, so I'm checking in. By the way, we're not in Maryland, unfortunately. Busboys it's in DC. We would need another one in Maryland on the other side of the street.
Let's go over the street. All right, folks. So, our last question person brought up a very good point. If you are interested in participating in Boardwatch, it is something I highly recommend you do. Basically, you go in as a member of the public into the local courthouse, and you literally sit there and you watch and observe the legal proceedings to make sure the system is working. Maybe not as it should, because we're learning. That's a certain way. But working for the best of its citizens. You can follow on Twitter, Be More Court Watch, and also PG Court Watch. I know the PG Commonwealth goes down to Highville District Court. And all right, with that little plug, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you all so much. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Please make sure to say thank you to your server who took such great care of you tonight. Kristin will be signing books afterwards, and we have them for sale. Give me just a few moments to make some house cleaning things, and then we can get started. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening, and peace and love.
Yes, please, oh my God. Because
That was like his favorite game as a kid. Throwing snowballs at cars and metro buses.
yeah.
Metro buses.
Well, it would be great to have it because I knew where I do training. It's kind of like, people know. I've done this. So, good. I'm so happy.
Yeah.
Coming from a.
Yeah, he was on camera, but his papers were only into the
Yeah.
But this one's a great turnout, and this is really exciting.